Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the TEENN Webinar Series Season 2. This is your host, Danny. Today, we have exciting and very informative topics intended for you. These topics are focused on online pedagogy and online learning platforms. We are fortunate to have with us an esteemed and able speaker on teaching and learning innovation all the way from the Grand Canyon state of Arizona, United States of America. And later this afternoon, we will again present another online learning platform from the IBM Philippines. Before we begin, we would like to greet also our followers and viewers all the way from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, as far as Cavite, Zamboanga, Tacloban, Aklan, Pasay, Antique, Naga City, and as far as Canada. And of course, we would like also to greet our YouTube subscribers, our 3,300 YouTube subscribers, our 8,942 likers of Facebook, 693,361 reach viewers, and of course, our 100,000 Facebook followers. Of course, for today, before we begin, we would like to greet also our participants from Region 1, of course. Special mention. Thank you for joining us once again. To all our followers and subscribers, let us continue to become hopeful that things will get back to normal. Let this global pandemic become our motivation to think creatively and utilize various platforms in delivering our syllabi and provide creative and utilize various learning platforms in delivering our syllabi and provide a once-in-a-lifetime experience to all learners. This is a challenge to all of us, and I believe that we will be able to surpass this burden victoriously. So, what are we waiting? To begin with, please allow me to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is an epitome of excellence in online learning education in the United States. She is currently the Assistant Dean of Online and Innovative Pedagogies at Northern Arizona University of the United States of America, where she taught for over 23 years in English, educational technology, leadership, dance, and pilates. Our speaker teaches face-to-face, blended, and online learning classes at NAU. And she also teaches online classes at Australia Mountain Community College. She loves to apply effective teaching principles and practices across the disciplines and to help others do the same. She speaks, writes, and presents and consults on teaching and learning theory and practice both nationally and internationally, and was featured expert in webinar series offered by the Association of College and University Educators in conjunction with American Association of State Colleges and Universities, or AASCU, Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, or APLU, CIC, and NASH. The series reached thousands of faculty members in 64 countries to share expert insights about easing the transition to online instruction during the coronavirus pandemic. She is the author with James M. Lang of Small Teaching Online, Applying Learning Science in Online Classes in 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome our first speaker, Miss Flower Darby. Good morning, Miss Darby.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we're fine. We're great.
Okay, well, happy to get started if that's okay.
Okay. So, welcome to the webinar series of the Commission on Higher Education Region 1 in the Philippines.
Thank you, Danny, and everyone who's here watching today. I appreciate your interest in becoming better online teachers. I know this is a new format for many people, but our current global pandemic has required people to begin to embrace teaching remotely and in online formats. And so I have some principles and practices to share with you today that I hope will help you to think about how we teach well when we're not in a classroom with our students. And so if you're here today, I think that you already have some feelings or some thoughts about online teaching. And I would like to start with that question. What is one word that describes the way that you feel about online teaching? If you would like to, you can make a note on some paper if you're taking notes by hand, or you can enter a note into your device or a document. Just think, what is one word that describes the way that you feel about online teaching? Well, I work with faculty all over the world, and I know that many faculty are highly aware of the challenges that we face in online teaching and learning. There are challenges, and I think it's really important for us to acknowledge those challenges and recognize that it's new for us and it's different. And we may not have had previous experience being online students ourselves. In fact, I would argue that probably most of us have not really been online students for any great length of time. And so therefore, sometimes we don't even know what online teaching really looks like. If you compare that to your experience being a student in a physical classroom, we've all had years and years of being students, and so we know what it looks like to teach effectively in person. But online, virtual, remote, that is new for many of us. It's a new area of research. We don't have a lot of literature about what this looks like when we do it well. And so understanding that these challenges can make it difficult for us to engage with our students and teach our content in the ways that we're used to doing, and maybe even really good at doing. For me, one of the biggest challenges relates to the fact that we are typically isolated from our students, and usually they are isolated from each other. This is a picture of Josh Eiler. He's an author of a book called How Humans Learn: The Science and Stories of Effective College Teaching. And Eiler makes a very important point about how we learn as social creatures. We are social beings, and from the very earliest weeks and months of our infancy, we learn by watching our parents and other people around us. We learn how to walk and talk and eat and engage in all kinds of social behaviors just by observing other people. And that is true in the classroom as well. As teachers and students, being together in person really enhances our ability to learn well from each other. And students learn a lot from each other, again, just by observation. They might look to a neighbor to see what page we're supposed to be on in a textbook, for example, but just having other people around us really makes it easier for us to learn. That's how we're made. But that doesn't typically happen in an online class. Oftentimes, we are not physically present with our students, typically, and many times we are not even in the online environment with them in the same moment. So right now, for example, we are all here in YouTube or Facebook, and we are engaging in the same space, albeit over thousands of miles. But sometimes, very often in online classes, we're not in the online environment with our students at the same time. And so the lack of social interaction and the lack of social connection can make it very challenging to help our students really learn effectively. Having said that, we do have lots of practical information to share with you today. And this is a roadmap of what we'll be talking about during this presentation. I would like to share one theoretical framework with you based on the research about good or effective online classes. Then I'm going to share 5 overarching principles, 5 general rules of thumb to operate by. And finally, we will end with 5 very practical strategies that will help you to teach and learn very practically things that you can do in your online and remote classes. So I do want to also explain that most of my comments are geared for faculty who are teaching in a learning management system. And it may be the case that you are not teaching in a learning management system, or an LMS as they are called, or maybe it's the case that you have recently begun to teach in a learning management system. Most of what I'm talking about today relates to that platform. But if you're not using one, I hope that you can still get some ideas and concepts that will help you connect with your students and teach them more effectively in whatever virtual or online environment that you're using. So with that, I would like to share the Community of Inquiry framework with you. This is a well-established, well-tested framework based on research that was conducted in the late 1990s about what goes into a good online class. If we really want students to learn well online, what are the necessary ingredients? The team of researchers published their findings in 2000, and they identified 3 distinct presences, or I like to think of it as ingredients, 3 elements that are necessary together to create a good online class. First is the cognitive presence. That is the thought work that goes into our online content, what we plan for students to do, what we provide for them to read, the assignments that we give them, the quizzes, the homework, and the practice problems. And it also refers to the thought work that students do in our online classes, how they are making sense of new information or concepts, how they're understanding ideas and relating them to each other, how they're being able to apply new information to solve problems. All of that is captured in the cognitive presence. The teaching presence refers to how we guide and facilitate learning in our online classes. And I think we have a lot to learn here still. As I mentioned earlier, many of us don't really know what it looks like to teach online. So how do we guide students' learning? How do we facilitate their discovery of new information so that they can make sense of it? And the third component is the social presence. And this goes right to what I was just talking about with the distance in an online class. The researchers found that in order for students to learn well and to achieve deep learning in online classes, they have to be in the class as people. And so do we. We have to be people in the class relating to each other, interacting with each other, and connecting with each other person to person, not just student to content, but as people we need to be interacting. Now, in 2012, a 4th researcher came along and proposed a 4th presence, the emotional presence, which is an acknowledgement that there are emotions that happen in online classes. I think there are emotions that happen in physical classrooms too. Learning is not the cold, rational pursuit of information that we have long wanted to believe that it is. There are emotions involved, and in fact, emotions help students pay attention and focus and remember new information. And so we really want to put the power of emotions to work for us. And these emotions are present in our online classes. Maybe we are struggling to enjoy them, or maybe we're nervous about online classes, or maybe our students are nervous. Those are all emotions that that we experience in online classes. So understanding that this framework is going to provide the foundation for everything that we're talking about today, the importance of both the thinking, the teaching, and the cognition, and the social interactions, and the emotional interactions that happen as well. So let's think about the importance of connecting with each other as people. How do we foster this kind of a connection and this kind of a learning community in our online classes. We know it's very important according to the research, but we don't know how. Well, to help us do that, I'm going to share these 5 principles that would be helpful for you to think about, broadly speaking, when you're teaching online. The first principle to share with you is that time takes on new meaning. When we teach in person, we are very used to having a set class meeting time. Perhaps our class meets on Monday and Wednesday at 9 a.m. for 90 minutes. And we know that during that time, we will be in the classroom. We plan what's going to happen, what we will say, what we will ask students to do, and we think about it as a discrete chunk of time. But typically, in an online class, we structure the units or the topics to take place over a series of days. Very often, this might be 1 week. So rather than thinking about what students are going to do on Monday at 9 o'clock a.m. and on Wednesday at 9 a.m., we think about what's going to happen from day 1 of the class week to the end of the class week. Maybe that might be Monday through Sunday as a common example. What are we asking students to do on their own time? Because asynchronous online teaching can be very effective and can save you time. So that what that means is it's not always necessary to be teaching your students in a live video format like I'm doing right now. That can be helpful, but it's not always necessary. You can also ask students to do things throughout the week or over a period of days to help them learn and engage and apply new content. So instead of thinking of set class meeting times, think about how many days is a unit or a topic or a module, and what should students be doing over the course of that time to help them learn the content. The second principle that I have to share with you might sound obvious, but I think it's often overlooked. It's very important when teaching online to show up to class. And let me explain what I mean. When we teach in person, again, we know that we have to be in that classroom on Monday and Wednesday at 9 a.m. We have to be there with our students in order to teach them. But many online faculty, when they're new to teaching online, they have not developed that sense of what it means to go to class. What does it mean to be in the online class with your students? Well, it means to be present with them. We saw in the community of inquiry framework that it's important to be present as a teacher and as a person in class. You have to be in the learning environment with them. And we'll talk more about how to do that after we get to the practical strategies. But for now, I have 2 suggestions for when you go to your online class. First, it's very important to be authentic. Be yourself as a teacher. Sometimes we are so new to teaching online that we don't know how to do it, and sometimes that means we don't know how to conduct ourselves. We might lose our teacher persona. But you can go into your online class and you can be yourself just the way you say you do in your physical classroom. You can write in your personal tone of voice so that the students get to know you through your class announcements and instructions. You can teach, if you are teaching by video, whether that's live or recorded, you can use your facial expressions and your vocal intonation to help your students get to know you. If you think about it, when you teach in person, students do get to know you just by the way that you look, the way you present yourself, the tone of your voice sounds, and your delivery style. So it's really important to be yourself in your online classes too. I know many faculty who become very robotic when they are teaching online, and it's important to bring your natural and your teacher personality with you into your online class. The second principle here is to be strategic when you go to your online class. So number 1, be authentic. Number 2, be strategic. And this is what I mean. It's very easy to spend way too much time in online classes. Students might be logging in and accessing content at any hour of the day or night because they can do that on their own schedule. But that does not mean that you should be in class 24/7. You want to create your own schedule, just like teaching in person. Identify blocks of time on your calendar every week that you're going to go to your online class and interact with students. It can be helpful to tell your students when you won't be available to answer a question. So, for example, in my online class, I tell them that I reserve Sundays for my family. And if my students email me on a Sunday, they won't get a response until Monday because I'm not going to be in class on Sunday. So you can help your students understand. Maybe if they email you in the evening after 5 p.m., you won't be able to respond until the next morning. It's helpful to communicate to your students when they can expect you to be active in the online class. So when you go to your online class, and it's important to do that, don't just leave your students in there to figure their own way out. They need you in there with them. When you go to online class, be authentic and strategic. Here's the third principle. This may sound somewhat foreign to you, but I will encourage you to put yourself in your students' shoes. And this goes back to what we said earlier about the isolation that we all experience in an online class. Typically, students who are taking their classes online are not sitting next to another student who's also taking that same class. Usually, each student is working by themselves at home or at a coffee shop or at a library, and they don't have another student to turn to and say, "Did you understand what we were supposed to be doing? I don't understand the assignment." And because students can't turn to a neighbor, and because they can't raise their hand and say, "Teacher, can you answer this question?" we have to be very careful about what we ask them to do and how, because they can't get a question answered. So when they are working by themselves, if they get confused, then they're on their own. Maybe they'll send you an email, but if you don't happen to be right there in that moment or online in a video conferencing platform, they won't get an answer right away. So this actually leads to the next principle, which is to be very intentional and purposeful. When you think about the fact that students are working by themselves in isolation without other people around them, it helps us to be much more explicit about what we ask our students to do and much more careful and thorough in the instructions that we give them. So when we can be intentional and purposeful, what this means is there's a lot that happens in the classroom that just happens naturally. Maybe you open every in-person class with a couple of announcements, reminding students of the work that is due or the test that is coming up. But all those natural, organic interactions don't happen very easily in an online class. They don't happen by accident. So that's why you want to be intentional and purposeful. And there are three aspects of this principle. The first is communication. Be intentional and purposeful in the way that you communicate with your students. Again, it's not easy to make the natural reminders or to connect the dots for your students the way you do when teaching in person. So you might need to over-communicate. You might need to schedule a regular weekly announcement, email, or an announcement in the learning management system that just keeps students aware of what's happening and let them know where they are in the content and how different concepts relate to each other, and be very intentional in the way that you communicate with your students so that they feel your guidance and that they feel supported by you, their teacher. The second element of communication intentionally is the way that you interact with your students. So again, I just mentioned you can send frequent announcements or emails that are timed at regular intervals so students know what to expect. But you also want to interact with your students in other ways as well. For example, you certainly will want to grade any of their online work in a timely fashion and give them feedback on how well they did and what they need to improve, so that students understand where they're learning, where they need to improve their practice. We can also engage in online discussion forums in the learning management system. We'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But if you were to engage in Socratic dialogue with your students in the classroom, you guide their learning by way of asking questions and drawing out the answers. And this is the same thing that can happen in an online discussion forum, but you have to be in there posting responses to their posts and asking those guiding questions. So the way that we communicate to our students, the way that we interact with our students, and thirdly, we need to be intentional and purposeful in the class content and activities that we give our students to complete. We don't want to assign tasks that are meaningless, that don't relate to the student achievement of the course learning goals. Everything that we ask our students to do in an online class format should be intentional and purposeful. There should be a reason that we're asking students to do that. And it can also be very helpful to tell your students what that reason is. Again, in the classroom, this happens quite naturally. We might say something like, "Do you remember last week when we were discussing this concept? Well, now it helps us to understand the new concept, the new information that we have to learn." You can make those verbal comments and reminders frequently in person, but it doesn't happen quite so well online. So first, make sure that your class activities are intentional and purposeful. And secondly, communicate what the intentions and what the reasons are for those things that you're asking students. The fourth principle, actually, I'm sorry, this is the fifth principle, and that is that students, because they feel isolated and they are isolated in online classes, it's important to make an extra effort to convey that you care about your students and that you support them. Two ways to do this, to convey that you care about your students. Number one is to provide explicit guidance. Again, very clear instructions, very detailed directions, so that students don't read what you want them to do for an assignment and have a lot of questions. Very important to provide extremely clear directions and to anticipate where students might get confused and provide additional examples, or maybe a criteria, a checklist of student things that they should do in that assignment, just to make sure that the guidance that you're providing students is explicit, very, very clear for number one. The second element of conveying caring and support is to intentionally make human connections with your students. Once again, this goes back to the importance of the social element, the social connections, person to person, that we have in our online classes. And that really easily gets lost in an online environment. It can feel quite distant, quite remote, and quite unfriendly sometimes. So make the effort to connect with your students person to person so that they know that you care about them. And I just want to share for a moment about an article that came out in June 2019 with findings of researchers who were looking at student persistence. What should college faculty do to help students stay in classes and complete those classes and complete their college degrees? The title of this article is "I Don't Care What You Know Until I Know That You Care." And it really does make a difference when our students feel that we care about their success. They are more willing to engage with us, even in online environments that feel distant. So the researchers found that there were no fancy pedagogical strategies of the faculty that communicated to their students that they cared about them. Instead, it was simply that they had gotten to know their students. They had gone to some effort to learn their names, to learn a little bit about their students. I know this may not always be possible, but anything that you can do in your online classes to help your students know that you see them as a person will really help your students engage with you. And that point was reinforced by Harriet Schwartz, who's the author of a book called Connected Teaching, and who published a blog post in April of 2020 about the importance of those human connections in online classes in particular, where students might feel lost. They might feel that you're not really there with them. Schwartz argued that it's very important to help our students know that we see them, that we care about them, and that our students matter to us. And she argued that when we connect with our students at their basic humanity level, when we connect with them person to person, that our students reciprocate by giving us energy and reinforcing our connection as person to person, and it energizes us in our online classes. I know many of us enjoy teaching in person, and sometimes we feel that it's not the same. In fact, it really isn't the same in an online class. But making the effort to reach out to our students and connect with them person to person, to let them know we care about them and they matter to us, will in turn feed our own energy in our online teaching, which is important because we want to enjoy our teaching as well. So those are the 5 principles that we're going to look at. And now we're going to consider 5 very practical things that you can do in your online classes to help your students learn effectively without meaning that you have to be in the online class all the time, or that you have to always lecture or teach in person live on video, because it's tiring. It's really quite tiring to do that. So the first strategy to consider is to provide content that is not live or dynamic. It's material that students can work through on their own. And in a way, this is what teachers have done for centuries by assigning a textbook or a reading and then having students come to class ready to engage with that material or to discuss it further. So in our online classes, it's not always about teaching synchronous or teaching in real time. In fact, I would argue you don't need to do that at all, really, although many of us in the last few months, that's what people resorted to doing because they weren't sure what else to do. Well, I don't think you have to teach live. You can give your students readings, and you can also record short video lectures of yourself. You can do that using lots of different tools and platforms. Research even shows that very casual smartphone-style videos really engage students, and they can learn very well from those. So if you post readings and pre-recorded videos, perhaps videos that you might find from other sources. There are a lot of very smart professors who have posted lectures to YouTube, as an example, that are freely available. Or perhaps TED Talks has some material. Maybe it's the Khan Academy that students can go to that does not require you to be pouring into the webcam in order for your students to learn. So consider in your learning management system, or if you're using a different communication tool, providing students with readings, videos, blog posts, anything that will help them engage and learn the material that doesn't require you to be there real time. However, the second strategy, we know that if we don't hold students accountable to do that reading and to watch those videos, that they may not do it. And so many students have learned that they can simply come to class and listen to the lecture, and maybe they don't have to study the textbook quite as thoroughly. But in an online class, especially if you're not doing live teaching, we need students to really work through the readings and the videos. And so a very efficient way that you can get students to make sure that they're doing the work is to use some of the tools in your learning management systems to have students do work to demonstrate to you that they did the reading and watched the videos. Most learning management systems have quiz or test functions. And some of those tests, if you create them as multiple choice or true false, will grade themselves. And that will really save you time. You can hold students accountable for the reading or the video by asking them quiz questions to check their understanding, and that will help them stay on track. Now, I know many people ask me, how do we know they don't have the book open in front of them? Well, they might. And so you want to try to come up with questions that are challenging enough that we can't just flip through the textbook pages and find the answer. You might tell your students that it's okay to use an open book or open note format, but the test questions themselves are written such that they require critical thinking or analysis or synthesis or problem solving, so that you can't just look up an answer. So recommend including quizzes or written assignments, written responses to the reading or the videos for every thing that you're going to ask students to review, all the content they should read and watch. You want to give them an assignment or a quiz or something that will keep them accountable for doing that work. And again, the learning management system has test features. It also has assignment submission tools where students can turn in a document or type into a text box. Some learning management systems allow students to upload a recording that they made on their smartphone. That might be a good way to check for student understanding. But I always recommend that you assign something worth some points that will hold students accountable for the work. The third strategy I mentioned earlier is the value of online discussion forums. Now, once again, in a regular in-person classroom, you can converse with your students, you can ask questions, get their answers, and explore a topic with them. So we can do a very similar thing in an online discussion forum that doesn't all happen at the same time, that students can post their questions or their information, and you don't have to be in there at the same time they are. Just like you might see in social media, for example, somebody might post something and then other people respond to that with comments or with engagement that doesn't happen in the same moment. The online discussion forums happen the same way. You can ask guiding questions. You can have students explore and apply new concepts. You can structure social interactions with other students in this asynchronous online discussion forum. That means something that doesn't happen at the same time. Students post when they're online, you post when you're online, because remember, it's important to be in the class with your students and to engage with them in a strategic way. When you post in your online discussion forums, all the students in the class see that, and so you're getting a lot of bang for your buck, where students are able to see and learn from the posts that you are making as the teacher and know that you are there in the class with them. And when they see you in class and see you interacting with them, that's another important way that students know that you care about them and that you support their learning. So consider those online discussion forums as a way. Again, most learning management systems have that tool and make it available. I like to encourage making those worth points also to get your students to really engage in a conversation. We have to hold them accountable for doing it. And points are the economy that students live by. So make the online discussions required and yet interesting. And there are ways to do that. And then two more strategies to share with you. First of all, it's very helpful to create a weekly routine. Notice I am not saying a rigid weekly structure, but a cadence or a rhythm that students can rely on in an online class. Again, we will compare what happens in person. Typically, students attend class on certain days at certain times of the week, and they know that. In elementary and secondary school, it might be 5 days a week from a certain time in the morning to an ending time in the afternoon. If it's a college class, it might not be every day, but there are still days and times that students know that they should be in class. But in an asynchronous online class, that is not really the case. Students might feel that they don't know how to proceed and make good progress if you don't provide some kind of a structure. So I like the idea of a weekly routine where, for example, students know that every module starts on a Monday and that on Wednesday they will have a quiz over the reading or the media. Maybe on Thursday their first discussion post is due. Perhaps on Friday there's a written assignment or another project, maybe a set of homework problems that is due. Maybe students are required to reply to each other in the discussion forums by Saturday. Maybe on Sunday there's a culminating activity or reflection that happens on that week's topic. But every week the same thing is due on the same day. That can really help your students, because otherwise online classes can feel very unstructured, and that doesn't really help some of our students make good progress. You can also establish weekly routines in the way that you send a welcome announcement every Monday, for example. Or maybe on Saturday, you send an announcement that wraps up the previous week and provides highlights. The way that you communicate and interact with your students can also help to create a regular weekly routine or a structure that helps your online students be successful. And finally, we have our fifth strategy to share with you, and we've talked about this a lot because it's really important, and that is to be visible and present with your online students. And here's what I mean by that. You might be in your online class and you might be grading assignments, as an example, such that only one student sees that you are engaging with them. But in order to let all of your students know that you're there in class with them, you want to make those public and visible interactions. The two easiest things to do are to post those announcements or to engage and post in a discussion forum. When you're teaching in person, you're at the front of the room and all of your students can see you there and they all know that you're there with them. You want to be intentional to do that in your online class as well, so that you make a post, you send an announcement, you ask a question, and all of your students can benefit from it, and all of your students know that you are there supporting their learning. Now, keep in mind, it might be that you might send an unscheduled announcement. Maybe you're picking up on some confusion. Maybe you've received the same question several times by email. It can be very helpful to send a clarifying, spontaneous announcement to say, I notice many people have this same question. Let me clarify, let me clear that up. And just things that you do that your students see you in your online class really goes a long way. Again, I remind you to be strategic. This does not mean that you have to be in class from first thing in the morning until the end of the day at night. Create for yourself a schedule. Log into your class frequently. I would say multiple days per week, just like you do when you teach in person. Be present with your students and help them to see you tangibly by what you're posting and how you're engaging with your students. So we have worked through our theoretical framework, which was the community of inquiry framework, 5 general principles to guide your practice, and 5 very specific strategies that will help you teach in an efficient and effective way so that your students are learning and so that you are not spending all of your time and energy in your online class, because that's not healthy. We all need to have a work-life balance and have time with our families so that we are well and engaged and able to interact with our online students when we're there with them. Now, on this note, I want to ask you to think back to the beginning of the talk. Do you remember? I asked you to think of one word that describes how you feel about online teaching. I'm asking you to think about that word that you chose, and I'm curious if that is still the same word now that we've looked at some practical ideas, or has your word changed? I would love to think that you might have a a new word, something positive, something hopeful, energized. So it's just a good idea to take a moment to reflect on your own feelings, on your own approach, as we try to become more effective online teachers. And so I'm going to end with one last question, and then I think we have time for questions from you. But the last question I want to ask you today is, what are 2 takeaways from today's session? If you were to pause, or maybe when this event is concluded, take a moment, jot down some notes or type up some notes perhaps, and think, what are 2 things, 2 principles, or 2 strategies, or one of each, or something from the community of inquiry framework that you want to take with you out of this presentation and into your daily online teaching practice? So I will leave you with that question, and I will wrap up my time and ask what questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Darby, for that very informative and amazing presentation.
Thank you.
No? I'm sure that all our participants will be able to answer your 2 questions. And if I may repeat, one word on how you feel about online teaching. The last question is the what are your 2 takeaways from today's session? So I'm sure that our participants will also ask several questions about your presentation. All right?
Sure. Yes.
So our first question, Ms. Darby, is from Alvin Carillo. Without a physical classroom, how can we check that students are engaged and progressing?
It's a very important question. And it's true that we rely a lot on our observation in the physical classroom. We're used to seeing for ourselves our students doing the work. And you're right, we can't see that without that physical classroom. But that's where those assignments and those quizzes come into play. So what you want to do is, here's what I do. Let me say that. If I ask a student to read anything or to watch anything in my online class, there will always be an assessment of the student having done that, and some way for the student to think about what they just learned and apply it. So what that means is lots of quizzes, lots of assignments or written online discussions. It could be a recording, a video or audio recording that students make on their smartphones if they have those. But what it means really, Alvin, is that we have to assign more tasks that provide observable evidence of student learning, since we can't see them for ourselves in the classroom.
Okay. For next question from Willie Ford Abunas. Some universities are planning modular approach with once a week face-to-face encounter. What collaboration and routine tips can you suggest for this arrangement?
Great question, and I think it can be relatively straightforward to structure that collaboration and approach. The main rule of thumb is that you want to use the time that you're face-to-face to get the most value. And so you are the expert, you're the teacher. What do students need from you in that one or that one meeting per week, that one face-to-face interaction per week? What is the best use of time that students can learn from you? Maybe it is an explanation of really complex concepts that is hard to do in writing in an online class. Maybe it's a question and answer session for students to learn from you. Maybe it's an opportunity to review materials prior to a big exam. And then once you think about the best use of time for that in-person, it's not in-person, but for the live interaction, then you want to structure the other activities in the learning management system in the module, like we discussed today. Other readings, homework, discussion forums, quizzes, assignments. You might assign group work for students to engage in. What could they be doing online with the content that will prepare them to come and engage with you, the teacher, the expert, in the live session? So when you think about it that way, I think it helps you to create a system for what happens when you're meeting live and what students do the rest of the time.
Wow. Very clear. Okay, another question from Lee Shan Bernadette. In your perspective, Miss Darby, how can we motivate a lazy learner to engage actively in class?
That is an age-old question of teachers everywhere, right? Because it's not just about online teaching and learning. It's about the students that we have in front of us in the classroom as well. Now, as we've said, when they're in the classroom, we can sometimes see them looking prepared and engaged, and we don't see that necessarily in an online environment. So if you remember, early in the talk, I talked about the emotions in online classes. That might be a new concept, but there is emotion science. It's a form of neuroscience, and it tells us that emotions can help motivate our students. All of our students feel less motivated sometimes. And so when we put emotions to work for us to help students focus and pay attention, that should help them to engage. And here's one simple example. For many teachers, it might sound crazy, but are there things that you can do, that you can ask your students to do, that will be fun for them while they're still learning? Now, again, maybe in elementary school, teachers give students learning games all the time, or maybe you yourself have tried learning games based on popular game shows like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or Jeopardy! Anytime that you can turn learning into fun by the way that you structure activities, then students will more naturally engage. They'll be more motivated. So more on that topic. That's a whole nother presentation about emotions and online teaching, but understanding that all students struggle to stay motivated and engaged, not just our online ones. And we can be creative to design experiences that are both informative and enjoyable to help our students stay engaged.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Another question from Gloria Tucson. Is there an ideal or maximum number of students in
Yes,
an online class?
sorry, Danny, sorry to interrupt. I do think that there is an ideal number, Gloria, and generally that number is as few as possible. That's not a very helpful answer. I think 25 is a really nice class size. You can engage with your students on a more individual level, and in that group, in that class size, students can engage with each other also. I know that for budget reasons and other valid reasons, sometimes our classes are bigger than that. But in order to foster the really rich engagement and interaction between teachers and students, smaller is better. I like 25 as an ideal number.
25 is the magic number.
Yes.
Okay. From Joy Bagtasos Pamaran, regarding the strategizing of the weekly activities, would it be taxing on the students for each of their teacher to give them 3 to 4 activities every week, considering that they are enrolled in at least 8 subjects?
That is an excellent question, and yes, it will be taxing on your students. There is an opposing point of view from mine. I like the idea of assigning lots of little things, but there are other experts in online education who say just 1 or 2 big projects per week. And not project, maybe it's 1 big quiz or 1 big activity or assignment or homework problem. The reason that I don't do that in my own practice is because I know it's very easy for online students to drift away. And so here's what I mean. Again, when we go to class in person, we know what building we're supposed to be in and what room on what day and what time. But learning management systems aren't that easy to go into. You don't just accidentally fall into your online classroom. You typically have to go there deliberately and log into the class session. And it's really easy for online students to get out of the habit of doing that if there isn't something due at various points of every week. So that's why I like that weekly routine. It helps students know that they have to log in multiple days per week. But I agree, if students are juggling lots of other classes, that could be challenging. So I would argue that each teacher needs to make a reasoned decision for themselves. What is the right balance? And again, specifically, if you're thinking that through, then that is the intentionality and the purposefulness that we talked about before. So maybe you have fewer if you know your students are taking 8 classes. Generally, my students are only in sometimes only 2 classes, the way that the American system is set up. And so finding the right balance is an important consideration. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Of course, another question from Philip John Milan. Teaching in the province and internet connection is poor. How can teachers assure that the course learning outcomes can be achieved using blended learning?
An important question, Philip, and I will say that where I am in Arizona, we also are quite close to some rural areas, the Navajo Nation, for example, does not have good internet connectivity. So we have the same situation here, maybe to a different extent. I recommend that you go low bandwidth as much as you can. Now, hopefully, even students in more remote locations can access internet sometimes. Maybe that means they have to go into town to an internet cafe or to the library, but at their home they don't have internet. I understand that. And so that's what I like best when the internet connection is low, so that students can find the time that works for them to access the internet and do their classwork. Now, sometimes even that is a challenge. I know some faculty in the recent emergency switch to online that happened as a result of COVID-19. I know some faculty that were having phone calls with their students because at least the phone connection was valid. And it may be, if you do teach live like this, maybe students could dial in on the phone and even just listen. But again, simpler and lower tech and asynchronous, those are the best ways to help all of our students enjoy equitable access to our content.
Wow, very clear. Okay, from Maui Gabrielio, what's your take about learners outsmarting teachers during online teaching in terms of technology usage?
Yes, that is such a good question, because my take is they're going to do it. Learners are going to outsmart their teachers. We're always going to have students who are better with the technology than we are. And what I have learned to do is to acknowledge that and to get comfortable with that fact and to learn from my students. So one of the classes that I teach is called Technological Fluency and Leadership, and it's about being fluent with technology in order to be a good leader. That's the whole class. But I am never going to know all the different apps that my students know and use. I'm not going to be up on the latest developments in video games, as one example. So I learn from them and I tell them, hey, do you have a better solution than what I'm familiar with? Now, that's a little bit of a pat answer. I think it's important to recognize, again, in online classes, there are challenges with students outsmarting instructors, maybe regarding academic integrity or, maybe inappropriate uses of technology to get away with less work. There's all kinds of things that could happen that are less positive. So again, my main strategy is to acknowledge that the opportunity exists, when possible, to learn from my students and to say, I'm here to learn with you too. I'm in the community of learners as well. And then the community of inquiry framework includes us as learners. And then as we were talking about earlier, when we were thinking about quizzes and maybe making them all open book as an example, just to acknowledge that there are things that students are probably going to do anyway. Can we turn those to our advantage or make use of those things in the way that we plan our online classes?
Okay. From Bernard Valdez Layos, I'm really beyond blessed for being part of today's webinar. Miss Flower really was given the most amazing ideas an educator needs. Thanks, Miss Flower. Your professionalism and your wit have no limits. God bless. So, instant fun. This is your instant fun, Miss Flower.
Well, now I am beyond blessed as well. Thank you for sharing that with me.
Okay. Another question from Alvin Carillo. Is there any specific strategy of healthy and effective learning environments that allow students to thrive in this new virtual setting?
You have some good questions, Alvin. That's a tough one. Yes, but what are they? um, Let's think just for a moment about this very unique moment of time that we're in. We have never been in a situation like this as a global society related to the pandemic and the impact that it is having on education. So I think it's very important to think carefully about the impact of the trauma that our students are experiencing. There is a thing called trauma-informed pedagogy. You could look that up if you would like, trauma-informed pedagogy. And it is actually related to what we talked about earlier about conveying caring and support. Understanding, it's a pedagogy of caring. So understanding that students are under a lot of stress and pressure. And again, I'm talking right now in this moment in time, but students who are taking classes online usually have other competing demands, responsibilities, and obligations. And so designing the learning environment and the activities that we ask students to do while putting ourselves in those shoes, in their shoes, remember that point from earlier, helps us to be compassionate, helps us to not be overly demanding, helps us to trust our students. I know many faculty who begin teaching online suspect that students will be cheating all the time. But if we can reframe our mindset such that we are here to support our students, that will create a more healthy and effective online learning environment. The other thing for me, I think learning management systems are not very pleasant places to be. I don't think they're nice to look at. And so anything that we can do ourselves to bring our own warmth, our own personality, our own positivity, and our optimism into our online environments. Again, this can be done by the way that you write, even the way you write announcements or instructions can be encouraging and supportive. That will really help make those environments into more healthy and effective places for our students to truly engage and learn.
Thank you. Okay. We still have two more questions, Miss Darby. Okay. Hi, ma'am, from Fem Dadison. How can we apply group work or collaborative learning specifically in science class experiments during online class?
Great question, and you can apply it to lots of disciplines. How do we do what we tend to do in class? How do we do that online? Well, it requires creative thinking. Luckily, every teacher that I know is a great creative thinker. So you have to think outside the box and try to get away from the way that you conceive of these activities in class. If you might normally put students in groups of 4 and give them a project or an experiment to do, what could you ask them to do online instead? And the guiding principle is to think about the goals for that experiment. As an example, if you want students to learn a particular quality about acids, and you might normally set up a science experiment with different liquids in a lab, is there another thing that students can do not in a lab that will help them to learn the same thing about acids? So maybe, I was trying to, what is the other thing besides acids? It's not coming to me, the opposite one. Anyway, maybe there's a household product that students could interact with, and you could have them texting each other or being on a FaceTime call or a WhatsApp conversation while they're doing the work in their individual kitchens, as one example. So getting creative about giving students activities that don't require the specialized equipment of a lab, that they can do wherever they are, and then structuring ways for them to interact in a way that might be different than what we do in the classroom. That can help. When you really think about what you need students to learn from that activity, it might help you think creatively about what else they might be able to do instead.
Thank you so much. And for the last, actually, this is not a question. but I am from Shivam Sony. Okay, I am from JAMMU or Jammu in Kashmir, India. Okay, the students here are facing a lot of difficulties as the internet is working in 2G at the time of 5G. They are not even able to watch YouTube videos on 240p. Actually, it's not a question, but
Well,
it's situational.
yeah, I can certainly acknowledge that much of what I have been talking about today assumes decent infrastructure. And I know that many of our viewers today are not in locations where internet is reliable or fast enough to support videos. I do understand that. So how do we teach online if the internet is not reliable? The default answer, once again, is to go low tech and low bandwidth with static readings and text. So for example, if students can send an email, maybe that is the way that they submit their assignment. Maybe they attach a file to an email and send it that way. The lowest common denominator of how we teach and learn when we're not near each other and internet is not very available is to think back to the correspondence course model. Whether or not you have personally experienced that, we are familiar with the idea in the olden days, I'll say, where students would sign up for a correspondence course and all the materials would be physically mailed to them. Students would do the work and mail back their tests or their assignments as proof of learning and mastery. And so even though I don't think it's ideal, it may be necessary to take a correspondence course mindset to setting up your online classes. And that's why not relying on video lecturing might be necessary. I taught for probably 8 years in online classes without ever using video. It is possible. It takes more writing. You have to write your text and more reading for students and more writing on their part as well. But going low tech and text based instead of video based is going to be the best way to support students with unreliable internet.
Okay. So for the last question from Ruth Maguds, we have different levels of intellect and status. Time is somehow an impeding factor, especially that most students have connectivity issues, including teachers do have the same issues. Is it possible or acceptable to be flexible about it, like extending online class time?
Good
Yes.
question. Thank you. Thank you, Danny. Good question, Ruth. I am a big fan of being flexible in online classes as much as we possibly can because we want to support our students. We understand that many people are in an undesirable situation, including oftentimes our teachers, ourselves, are struggling to have adequate internet speed. And so making more options possible for students does make the learning more equitable. And what I mean is that all students have equal opportunity to learn and engage. And again, I'm going to distinguish what many people around the world did in the last few months and maybe are still doing right now is teaching live like this. And this is a luxury. It may not be possible to teach by video to your students. I think the next best thing to do instead of teaching live, because honestly, I don't think it's necessary, instead of teaching live, recording short videos of yourself makes it more feasible when time and connectivity are problems, because then you can record it when it's good for you. Students can watch that when it is good for them and when they have internet access. But certainly the more flexibility that you can offer to your students, whether that be extending a virtual class meeting or allowing a flexible submission deadline for an assignment, or being willing to grant extensions on deadlines if students talk to you about a challenging circumstance they're in. Flexibility is actually extremely important in online teaching. It goes back to conveying to our students that we care about them and we support their learning. And it means assuming positive intention. If we think that our students want to learn and we want to help them learn, flexibility goes a long way. Thank you for asking that question. It's important.
Okay, on that note, thank you so much, Miss Darby. Uh, Indeed, you have inspired a lot of our viewers. Most of them are teachers. And any message to all your Filipino fans? You have a lot of fans, instant fans in the Philippines, Miss Darby. Any final words?
Yes, thank you, Danny. I just encourage everybody to embrace this opportunity. I know that none of us probably set out to be really great online teachers. That was probably not what we had in mind when we chose this career. But we have an amazing opportunity to help our students through a highly unusual time and to be better prepared for the workplace of tomorrow, where remote working and video conferencing and working with colleagues all around the world, it's increasingly common and important to develop the ability to relate and interact with people at a distance. So embrace the opportunity. Look for ways to step up to the challenge, support your students to do the same, and I wish you all the very best in your teaching online adventures.
Back form will be given this afternoon to all of our viewers, okay? And at this point, again, thank you so much, Miss Darby, for your time. Indeed, you inspired our 1,755 live viewers all over the Philippines and, of course, all over the world. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And with
Goodbye.
that, please don't fail to watch also our upcoming topics for this afternoon. I will be having the free digital learning on tech and professional skills of tomorrow. Our speakers will be from the IBM Philippines. Okay, two of them, Miss Andrea E. Escalona and Miss Abigail Lesaca. So, for our listeners, how to get an e-certificate? Okay, all you have to do is attend the morning and afternoon webinar session. The host will announce the feedback from form and quiz link after the last session of the day. Third, fill out the feedback form and take the quiz on or before 6 p.m. today. Okay? Those who pass or receive a passing mark of 4 out of 6 questions, the quiz 4 out of 6 on the first take, okay, will receive their certificates. And fifth, the previous sessions, download your certificate at webinar.chedrowan.com. Okay, I repeat, webinar.chedrowan.com. All right? Again, thank you to our viewers. Thank you to our participants. Thank you especially to our resource speaker. And thank you for all the women and men of CHED Region 1. All right? With that, don't forget to subscribe our Facebook and YouTube. All right? And as we continue to bring you a lot of exciting topics for related for today's pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, I should say. With that, again, thank you so much for subscribing, viewing, and attending this webinar series. Thank you so much. On behalf of CHED Region 1, maraming salamat sa inyong lahat and keep safe everyone. See you this afternoon.